that are in here. All right, let's do this. Symbolic rage. Postbellum lynching, in which the general rationale for mob and state terrorism was that it countered black male sexual violence against white females, exemplified the symbolic rage of post-sectorial performances of the state. Symbolic rage is connected to such performance in that the symbols associated with one's fury supersedes and determine responses to specific abuses that have allegedly sparked that fury. Violent anger is supposedly inspired by the myths of symbols that precede and take precedence over the specific criminal act. Anti-lynching campaigns, led in part by Ida B. Wells, demystified symbolic rage, the white, quote, civilized fury against black, quote unquote, the S word, which we would say utilize against indigenous people too. Noting that the charge of rape was used as a general apologia for mob violence and state complicity in or indifference to it. Wells proved that many of these accusations tended to be false and that the charge of sexual violence was only leveled in the fraction of lynching cases of white men who, as a caste, were the prosecutors and executioners of sexual violence, as well as the perpetrators. Wells wrote in 1895 that to, quote, justify their own barbarism, they assume the chivalry which they do not possess, end quote. Designating interracial sex, specifically that between black men and white women. Most of the heinous form of criminality, moral and social leaders, based on legality of lynching, on racial and sexual myth, and on a white code of chivalry that featured a macabre. I gotta look at this word. I can't say it. Be right back. First word of the day. Is describing and horrifying because of involvement with the depiction of death and injury. Okay. All right, sounds good. All right, macabre diet played out in bipolar stereotypes of white knights and ladies pitting against the threat of black sexual brutes and S-words. In Wells' era, European American women, particularly those from the property class, hold on a second, I'll look at my things, property class, were perceived as inherently virtuous and thus absolved of any charges of sexual promiscuity or miscegenation? I don't know this word either. I'll be right back. Another word. Miscegenation. That's a new one. Oops. Hold on. Miscegenation, which means sexual relationships or reproduction between people of different ethnic groups, especially when one of them is white. All right. So, miscegenation. I can't say. The European American men, again, particularly of the upper classes, were considered inherently chivalrous and thus absolved of charges of sexual violence or miscegenations. That one word. African American men, on the other hand, were identified as grapists, defined as inherently promiscuous. African American women could not be violated because they were said to be without virtue. A white man would not grape a lady, a white woman, and could not grape an object, a black woman. Oh my gosh, intra-class grape of white women, including incest, was usually presented as a seduction of the white adult male. A white woman could not desire a brute or likely join in the coalition with someone considered to be a sexual object. During the era of lynching, voluntary sexual associations between black males and white females were obstructed as grape and were punishable by death. Of the African American involvement, Wells and others argue that the mythology of black sexual pathology that motivated lynching functioned as the apologia for grape in a society where actual and alleged assaults against whites were persecuted, while convictions in cases of sexual violence against black women were rare. Female African Americans anti-lynching activists confronted the convergence of racist and sexual violence, urging white women to respond to the political use of grape charge in lynching cases. These activists argue that the prosecution of actual sexual violence for either white or black women was not the objective of the lynch law. The majority of sexual assaults were in fact intraracial. Although national crime statistics for sexual violence were not recorded in the 19th century, today statistics are illuminating. Currently, the FBI reports that more than 90% of rapes are interracial. In interracial rape cases, the percentage of white males as assaults on black women exceeds that of black males assaults on white women. 100 years ago, the percentage of black male assaults on white women was even lower, given racial segregation and the social restrictions on white women, while the percentage of white males assaults on black women was higher, as black women worked as domestic servants in white homes. White males who had virtually immunity as the caste that adjudicated, legislated, and enforced the laws. From prosecution to prosecution for sexual violence against black women, and near immunity from attacks on their female family members or on white women or of the lower classes. In fact, the majority of sexual violence in Wells' era was committed by white men who were and remain the most likely assailant of white women, and who were also responsible for a considerable amount of violence in the lives of black women. A true correlation between the occurrence of lynching and the prosecution of sexual violence should have meant that the majority of those lynched in the postbellum era were white men, yet the victims were largely African American. The collective punishment was inflicted on black communities where property was stolen or destroyed by lynch parties, that the specificity of the crimes and their punishment was treated as inconsequential by mob and state prosecutors, and non-existent crimes were alleged. And finally, that the rare phenomenon of black male sexual assaults on white females became a national maker of sexual violence. All these facts reveal how the state and society outrage over sexual violence is based on symbols and mythology that justify the use of ritualized racial violence. If perpetrators of state violence require demonization to justify their symbolic rages, then entertainment is indispensable to their prosecutorial performances. as spectacles, lynching, and later legal execution, racialized and politicized sexual violence. Sexual violence that violated classist and racist hierarchies was constructed as the most heinous form of abuse and so was given the most heinous form of punishment. Demonization of racialized sexuality as criminal promoted mass and participation in lynching and furthered indifference to interracial sexual violence that did not reflect the racial mythology. Symbolic rage validated mob vigilantism, state I can't say this word. You try it again. Another word, everybody. It's malfeasance, and that means oh my gosh, bring you back up, come on. Malfeasance, which means wrongdoing, especially by public officials. Malfeasance and police. Hold on a second. Come on. Go back to my thing. Thank you. There we go. Malfeasance and police violence in the name of protecting quote-unquote women. Prosecutorial performances rarely emphasize the specifics of the crime, the importance of just laws, or the rights of the accused or the survivors. Instead, such ambition engendered a fixation of generic types of sexual beasts, heroes, and heroines. Institutionalized, legitimized the patronal symbolic rage and state violence needed to specificity of crime because of prosecution was directed by mythology. Subaltern rage also entails demonizing, but it is often grounded in material conditions of oppression. Quote, ordinary, quote, unquote, sexual violence, that is, interracial instances, become overshadowed by, quote, extraordinary, end quote, racial violence or interracial occurrences. Until sexual violence crossed caste borders, violated race and class hierarchies, it was considered private and commonplace in its transgression of such borders. It became public and doubly offensive to state sensibilities. In general, the prosecution of private violence, when it occurs, is routine. The prosecution of public violence, in contrast, is highly ritualized, in keeping with the symbolism, lending itself to empathy, and social denial of the prevalence of racial and sexual violence. Symbolic rage is prosecutorial performance. I'm gonna look up that word. Let's look up that word. I've said it so many times. And it means relating to the institutions and conducting of legal proceedings against someone in respect of criminal charge. Prosecutorial. Such a hard word to pronounce for me. Prosecutorial. All right. Hey, Coco, welcome back. Oh my gosh, come back. Prosecutorial performances demanded an audience. As I argued earlier in reference to Foucault's discipline and punishment, public prosecution and executions are essential to spectacles. In its larger-than-life punishment, the ritualized, pageantry, state violence provided an imagery, parameters, and meanings of persecution and justice in lynching cases. Prosecutorial performances. I first began reflecting on symbolic rage in state prosecution when reading Ida B. Wells' political memoirs, Crusade for Justice, the autobiography of Ida B. Wells, which we have in our library. Yet it was my mother's unfinished autobiography which described how a family tragedy of domestic and sexual violence transmuted into racialized spectacles and sport that led me to reconsider the impact that race, rage, and the law have on our lives. Typically, my family never speaks of the incident. Understandably, family elders do not keep alive a story that permits neither pride nor comfort in the telling. Although the persistence of the story counts for something, it reveals no resolve, as in the stories of rage and resistance offered in Maya Angelou's autobiography. Maya Angelou's autobiography account of male relatives who buried her pedophilic rapists in the cornfield, or Wells' description of black families who avenge white violence. The only story of outrage I recall from my mother describes the night she spent roaming with her 5-year-old twin sister and older siblings to decapitate black jockeys gracing the lawns of white homes, retelling parts of familial stories, freeing them to function with the best or the worst of intentions. I revealed my own discontent, which is 3 generations removed from black Mississippi fear and white prosecutorial performances. I can't say that dang word. In the 1920s and 1930s, my mother's black red mother. I had no idea what that means. I hope I didn't say anything. Mammy raised her 5 children in rural Mississippi. Most of the time, they lived in Holly Bluffs, sometimes on, sometimes near a plantation farm. My great-grandmother, Virginia's 16 children, and writes my mother, a very beautiful dark-skinned black woman. My great-aunt was a favorite among not only black, but also white people in Holly Bluffs. This was in small part due to her looks and in great part due to her character. Generosity was one of her most striking features. Aunt P, never my mother's emphasis, had a relationship with a white man. Her popularity with whites came from her culinary talents, charm, and strategic acumen. She baked well and often brought cakes to the local white sheriff's office. Aunt P was also given presents. Black men courted her with gifts. At 19, after receiving the gift of an automobile from one man, Albert, she kept seeing another black man. Having warned her of his jealousy, one day he took her life with a shotgun. Stepping from behind the bushes near my great-grandmother's doorstep, she shot P as she strolled near home. Many in our family and its community who loved my great aunt, included the other men she knew, were outraged at her death. None of these, however, sought the persecution of her killer. Whites did. Within days, a posse, which likely included the sheriff, found where Albert was hidden, dragged him out, and lynched him. Oh my God. The lynchers marvelized murder into sport and spectacle, leaving little space for mourning. They created after the mess Albert left for my great-grandmother in her yard. Another mess to clean up, another atrocity to contain. That what was to be clear, the framed would shape the ground on which local black people stood in relationship to pain and punishment as state performance and white ritual. How to find the move to other sites without losing their footing must have bewildered black Mississippians standing so far from justice. Sorting out the posse's public rage and my family's pain for my great-grandmother's private grief and anger is difficult. I imagine that rage without grief is a flight from pain. The symbolic rage is an antithesis of grief, that it preempts mourning and suggests that there is nothing to fear if demons are punished. Rage at the state seems to be deflected. Its splinters strikes subjects and objects at varying distances, reflecting on how little trust there is in the state protection. Rage at Albert fluctuates between rightly blaming him for his great aunt's murder and wrongly blaming him for his own lynching, with the reasoning that any pre-World War II black person unintelligent enough to murder a pretty young black woman who begged for the local white sheriff courted death. The state proved that it did not need to bring Albert before family or community for sentencing, for grief, or for healing, and thus excluded them from determining restitution. The state embodied in the lynching mob and the court owed Albert and owned Albert and could dispense with him and justice, and it as it saw fit. Private rage and grief would be respectful to the memories of P and Albert, yet the numbing familiarity of symbolic rage is immediately forthcoming. I can use it myself. It is emotionally, although not always professionally, safer to rage at white and male abstractions. Neither attentiveness to detail nor counter strategies are required, while specificity does not antithesize abstract generalities, bringing relief from deep feelings, clarity, and responsible action. Understandably, one could be reluctant to feel an anger that could slide into fear, pain, and later perhaps resistance. My great-grandmother and her family felt grief and a private rage that had no symbols for public expression in a white world. It was permissible for black people to rage at Albert, but not at his killers. Mississippi black people could have vicariously participated in his pursuit and death, or like black ministers in Walter Van Tilburg Clerk's The Oxbow incident, go along to pray for the departed and the living. Either of those roles, expressing their rage or sorrow, would have been somewhat risky given the unpredictability of lynching mobs. This is true before the Civil War for whites, the majority of lynching victims then, and for post-bellum black people, and the majority of victims after the war. In lynching, there were no more promises of safe return, especially for those whose status was more like the hounds that the hunters. Black Mississippians, in fact, were given fewer guarantees of survival than the hunters' dogs. More than one black person in Holly Bluff may have cheered the posse. On the other hand, more than one might have quietly wished for Albert's escape, which could indicate either misogyny or indifference to sexual violence, or the privileging of racist violence as more heinous than interracial sexual violence. Hoping for his escape might also merely show that some black people possessed a sense of justice not tied to lynching rope. Others may have dismissed the possibility of justice in that state where white vigilantes had immunity for persecution for black kin were at their mercy. Still others may have felt or feigned differences to both victims and the mob, choosing to let go of the dead and those who might as well be gone. They offer no prayer of protection and buried the dead in silence. Disturbed by the execution, anyone praying for, cursing, or trying to ignore Albert's attempt to stay alive likely damned the authoritarian killers, whose rage was unlike justice, and by its excess as in, oh my gosh, identifiable as a lover's jealous brutality, because killing Albert did not bring his victim back to life. The point of his death remains debatable. Was the execution restitution or revenge? And yet, do not restitution and revenge belong by right to the sufferer or her or his family? Social punishment and execution, like self-punishment and suicide, seem to be both restitution and revenge. The posse's vengeance may have been an expression of its members' pain mingled with anger. Stories about Mississippi crackers suggest that the lynching party's emotions likely stem in part from indignation, that any black man who dared take away a woman, even black one, who belonged to them. Psychologizing the lynching party, however, does not obscure its omnipotence, racial power vested by state authority. Justice, of course, was the prickly issue. The posse killed as part of law and order campaign. Yet the prosecutorial performance that led to the execution of a murderer did not inspire a great sense of safety among African Americans. Racial violence as public violation felt by the community. Historically, lynching included collective punishment, would ellipse sexual violence as personal violations felt by an individual. So what was initially my great aunt's story becomes Albert's story. Mourning P was supplanted by concern over Albert's persecution and punishment. Not being white, Albert would have no trial date or legal prosecution, a custom recognized but not sanctioned by both whites and black people. The law was white, and so the punishment, although deadly and irrevocable, seemed whimsical and unpredictable. Prosecution generally tends towards whimsy in respect to black life. Whimsy would have stood in his favor. Although if Albert had been a special black person, they use the N-word, if he had had the good fortune to be popular among white men, or to, quote, belong to some prominent white man in his hometown, men of influence would have argued for leniency. For instance, white folklorist Alan Lomax was successful in his plea to the Texas governor for the pardon of blues singer Leadbelly Huddy Ledbetter, who was incarcerated for murdering a black woman. Let me look back real quick. I need a drink. And we got, hey, chicken strips are still here. Thank you for coming. I don't know if you're still here. Breaking up a little. Am I still breaking up? Still breaking up? Hello? Yeah, no? Yes, no? Hello? Still breaking up? Anybody want to answer? Hello? No one here? No one can hear me? Look at the comment below that. There is no comment below that. The comment below that is nope. It's nope. No lag. All right, cool. Other white patrons have had less good fortune. After calling for the execution of black and Latino youths accused of brutally raping a white woman in Central Park in an advertisement in the New York Times, Donald Trump successfully pleaded for boxer Mike Tyson before his conviction of raping a black woman, Desiree Washington. If Albert had been a popular entertainer for white people, for example, a military hero like Othello, or a sports hero like OJ, it is unlikely that he would have been lynched for killing a black woman. Although he most certainly would have died horribly for killing a white one. But as a, quote, ordinary N-word with the ER, end quote, Albert was also, by definition, unlucky as entertainment rather than entertainer. He could not survive sport, which overtook tragedy. Albert was transformed by spectacle and prosecutorial performance. Until the lynching party arrived, there was probably nothing particularly unique about this man. His newly gained performance only heightened his significance. Albert became special the day that whites decided to lynch him, not the day he killed my great aunt. There was certainly nothing unusual about his crime, because someone's woman kin is murdered daily by a male friend. Every day 4 women die at the hands of their male partners. Sexual violence seems a commonplace epidemic, giving the prevalence of domestic violence as a form of sexual violence. Only the lynching seems extraordinarily uncommon. Today, Albert would not have been lynched for legally executing for killing a black woman, given the racial disparities in death sentences. If his victim had been white, sensationalism would have memorialized the spectacle so that future generations could use it to illustrate either black sexual or white racial savagery. That's white, sorry, depending on what point the writer wanted to make. The lynching moves to monopolize my attention, quickly dominating everything except my grandmother's grief. Because the lynchers, this man, not even a blood relation, upstages our family's tragedies at both victimizers and victim. His image is insecure, parasite, feeds on that of my great aunt. To jettison Albert, to throw him out like the breeze, or at least regulate him to a footnote in this story. However, would be in bad faith. On some level, we seem to occupy the same skin, uncut by gender and blood. Hortense Spillers writes that an enslaved African American female, quote, shares the condition of all captive flesh, end quote, as the quote entire captive community becomes a living laboratory, end quote. For such women, the theft of mutilation of the body creates a special condition in which, quote, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome of the female body, and the male body become a territory of culture and political maneuvers, not at all gender related or gender specific, end quote. In contrast, Zélie Einstein, it's not Einstein, it's Eisenstein, points out that these shared conditions erase neither the female body or the site of sexual violence, nor gender specificity in violence. The battered, the rapist, the irate husband / lover / father / brother knows no engendered female body. Still, to return to Spillers, the meaning of sexual abuse are shaped by the status of the, quote, captive communities, end quote, members of the state, quote, laboratories, end quote, or or theaters for punishment and discipline. Those who are doubly bound by racial and sexual violence seem timelessly stitched together, yet ties to violent males and state executioners need not become entanglements that hide the commonalities between captive and captor communities, which can lead to organizing sites for safety and mourning, and to confronting the specificity of crime without racialized methodologies and persecutions. Social texts, Black women and sexual violence. That's the next thing we're going to read. Next section. Let me look back a little bit. All right, nope. All right. The common ties among women confronted sexual violence are evident. Several years ago, my godsister S told me that when Taki, a 14-year-old African American, immediately reported that she had been raped by a white transit policeman, her story was generally received as unreliable, even by her mother. So Taiki went to a girlfriend's house and called the ambulance that took her alone to St. Luke's emergency room. Once there, she persisted until hospital staff eventually listened and treated her, despite a white male intern's initial combative insistence that she had not been raped. As the upper-class white woman, S brought a legitimacy to Taki's story in retelling it to me and others. Affluent but females, S could not translate her class status into enough clout to report a white working class male cop against crimes against black poor girl to the New York Police Department. Unable to have an officer sanctioned, Taki now finds an alternative route to and from school, selecting other subway stops to avoid police officers assigned to her home station. S's intercessions for Norma, a 15-year-old Latina who was periodically beaten in the streets by her ex-boyfriend, were more fruitful. Both were able to report the assaults to city agencies, but at the bureau desk that determines who qualifies for a hearing to obtain a restraining order. A woman behind the desk denied Norma a court date. But S and Norma were unable to sway juvenile authorities along with some of Norma's girlfriends. These state employees insisted that Norma had walked not only in her ex's neighborhood, but on his street at the time of the attack. And so she courted her own abuse. Like Taki, Norma was now finds other routes to travel. Unsurprisingly, sexual violence is generally underreported. Survivors are more likely to tell their stories when they feel they will be believed and treated compassionately. Such treatment is somewhat difficult to find in a culture that desensitizes spectators to violence and markets violence as a commodity, particularly when sexual violence occurs in the lives of non-whites. Given the stereotypical projection of, let me look up this word, be right back. Let's get to it. All right, let's bring you up. Come on, there we go. A promiscuous and unprincipled in sexual matters, discarded accepted rules of conventions, especially in grammar. I think it's the first one. Oh no, wrong one. Let's do this. Doo-doo. Okay. Hello. There we go. Alright, let me open this back up. Alright, licentious, unnatural, and violent sex unto darker skinned peoples whose sexual reprobates this deviance is triply complicated by sexism, classism, and heterosexism. Black women's experiences of violence is shared with all women, but magnified by racism and classism, giving the stigma of an Africanist sexuality. Subaltern or captive communities have little credibility, even among themselves. Generally, sexual violence is most believable if the survivor has privilege over the accused. Those who are adult male, light-skinned, affluent, or heterosexual are considered more credible and authoritative than those who are young, female, dark-skinned, poor, gay, lesbian, or bisexual. In his documentary, Ethnic Nation, Marlon Riggs illustrates how cultural representation of racial and sexual others have rationalized atrocities against African Americans. Objectified as either hypersexual, they used WHORE, or asexual mammies, both eager to serve white males. The black female has been intertwined in caricature with stereotypes of black African men as either aggressively oversexed, the black rapist, or neutered as the family retainer. I'm not going to say it. Uncle, never mind. The image of black women is promiscuous, which has manufactured by black males, deflecting deflected attention from racialized sexual violence inflicted by white men. Historically, the rape of enslaved African women was common. Not until the 20th century did the courts in general began to recognize that black women could file charges against their assailants. The construction of black people as quote-unquote animals rather than humans shaped representation of sexuality, defining black female sexuality as a site of bestiality and illictness. I gotta look up this word. Be right back. That's what it was. Sorry, everybody. Illicitness. Black feminist writers have explored the developing status of African women under enslavement, as well as African American women's resistance to this oppression. Paul Giddings notes that changes in Virginia law concerning indentured servants culminated in 1661 when Virginia officially recognized slavery. African women were subsequently referred to in law as, quote, nasty and beastly. That's horrible. Sorry. This new entity could now be impregnated to create a new, quote, crop of enslaved people, because under the new legal status, children would assume their mother's status. In 1691, law prohibited whites from marrying indigenous and African people. In addition, quote, property, slave, prostitutes, wife, children, prison inmates, as said to have no legal rights. Similarly, subhuman females had no virtue. The alleged absence of sexual virtue affected and still affects the legal standing of African American women. Europeans and European Americans cannot present the image of the black without the fantasy of black sexuality that is both titillating and terrifying for those who indulge in it. So here's a book by Fanon called Black Skin's White Mask, which is another book that talks about this particular thing that she's addressing right now. So if you want to, you can also pick up the book Black Skin's White Mask by Frantz Fanon that talks about this stuff. In popular mythology, African Americans were considered only capable of lust, whereas whites could love, still sleep with black females was seen as a rite of passage for white male manhood. Oh my God. Social respectability is premised on, quote, proper sexuality. White women committed racial and social suicide when they aligned themselves with black black women, brown women, and Asian and indigenous women against white men accused of sexual attacks. In other words, maintaining their personal integrity and morality is rewarding with a loss of conventional respectability. Not only are such women called race traitors, but by defending a historically virtueless victim, they also transgress women's white standards of sexual decency. For instance, Suzanne Ross, a white woman, advocated fair proceedings for black and Latino youth accused of rape and battering, recounts how white women hissed, quote, "race traitor," end quote, at her as she took her seat on the stage during a talk about how the Central Park Grape case. Conversely, women of color who joined white women in confronting men of color accused of sexual violence are also labeled race traitors. The dominant society, however, grants these women a social respectability of sexual mortality that it typically denies white women who support black or brown defendants. Individuals without social, political, or economic qualities have little legal qualities. That this is true not merely for defendants, but for victims and survivors too. Women without racial equalities are not sexual equal to men or women of the dominant race. They subsequently have no equal legal protections in case of sexual violence because persecution is administered by the racialized state. The state enforces their rights, therefore is seen as whimsical. Sexual equality between respectable and respectable women would, in the absence of gender equality with men, merely provide great recognition of other quote-unquote women as spectacles in violence. Sexual reprobates have difficulty in proving themselves as victims. By definition, sexual deviants transgress social norms, thus violating such an adherent person is seen as an oxymoron. This problematized status, which places women outside of protection of legal and social concern, lead to anti-lynching campaigns of African American women, historically critique of the sexual politics involved in racial violence and lynching. Although some veneer of sexual innocence can be maintained, the prostitute with a heart of gold, a loyal, oh my gosh, they say wait, that's not, what is that word? I gotta look up a couple words, everybody, again. The words. Because I'm gonna have to say it, I'm sorry, Pocahontas, which we know is not Pocahontas. That's just the name that the colonizers gave them. And another word, Malachi, which are both women, powerful leaders. So, yeah, we know that the Pocahontas is not the real name of that person. I don't think. The public is not socialized to view black females sympathetically in great cases, given their historical construction as WHOR, not gonna say it. Maternity also works against black women who are represented as a source of social decay rather than mothers. They are alleged to reproduce or breed criminals and deviants, characterized by the subsequential bad or destructive mother. the black woman categorically lacks credibility as a victim of social violence. The destructive mother image tends to be appended to women who advocate the right to choose to regulate childbearing. They are portrayed as the enemy of the child or fetus. Social bias is evident given how violence is considered newsworthy and then rendered sensationalist. Few of the sexual violence cases reported in the New York Times in the late 1980s and early 1990s involved white males accused of assaulting black females. The equal expression of national outrage for highly publicized trial of white men accused of sexually assaulting women of color is an anomaly. Of those cases that did the most notable were the Tawana Brawley investigation and the St. John's Grape trial. In each situation, the black girl or woman involved had no credibility. Brawley's case, directed in the media by Aton Maddox, Vernon Mason, and Al Sharpton, was considered a hoax. The television show Law and Order ran an episode on May 17, 1995, factionalizing the Brawley case with a message that even though the legal system is racially unjust, it is the best we have. In the other case, white athletes from St. John's University were acquitted of charges of gang rape and sodomy of a black female student. Jesus Christ. In both fictional and news accounts, some of the most sensational representation of sexual violence have depended on black characters and caricatures. White American pop culture classic such as D.W. Griffin's Birth of a Nation, Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, and King Kong recycles images of white heroes foiling and avenging black demons who threaten or sexually assault fantilized white women, white male chivalrous knights, white female virtuous ladies, black males sexual brutes, and black females sexual objects, all performed for a national culture mythology that is the backdrop of social and symbolic rage against sexual violence. Although the majority of sexual assaults are intraracial, not interracial, the media observes its most sensationalist accounts for those cases in which the accused or convicted is black. News sources often privilege accounts in which black assailants violate racial and class hierarchies. When the victim of survivors is from a privileged caste and the accused is from a marginalized class, the assault becomes one against caste and is prosecuted as such by the state. If the victims are socially subordinate to the assailants, the violence becomes a lateral and figurative index of subaltern oppression by dominant groups. Most of the infamous cases reported in the New York Times in the 1980s and 1990s centered on African American males who assaulted black or white females. Where Asian, Latin, and Native American women appeared in the relationship to black males is obscured. Black people in sexual assault cases served as a catalyst for social reflection on the rage at sexual violence. Surreptitiously, I did that right, they also serve as entertainment. Toni Morrison notes that Africanism, quote unquote Africanism, has become a way of talking about and a way of policing matters of class, sexual license, and repression, formations and exercises of power, and mediation and meditation on the ethics and accountability, end quote. Africanism provided the setting of racialized treatment of sexual violence and selective condemnation of it. State scripts, crime, punishment, and performance. Next section. Well, everybody's doing okay. I know there's a lot of words in here. A lot of words. I've had to do a lot in this words. Between 1930s and 1964, 90% of men executed in the United States for rape were black. One study of sentencing found that black men convicted of raping white women received prison terms 3 to 5 times longer than those handed down in any other rape cases. Yet, at the same time, that black on white rape invoked the most horror and outrage. It was by far the least common form of violent sexual assault. And an investigation of rape case in Philadelphia in the late 1950s found that only 3% of them involved attacks on white women by black men. John D. Emilio and Estella B. Friedman, Intimate Manners. John D. Emilio and Estella Friedman write that despite the frequency of black attacks on white women, the image of the black rapist has been used to control black men and, quote, instill fear into white women who moved too freely in the public world, end quote. Interracial sexual violence is involved in less than 10% of reported rapes, according to the film Rape Culture, which states that white males sexually assault black females at twice the rate that black males assault white females, 8% and 4%, respectively. Interracial rape is the cultural marker of the horror of sexual violence. Representation of such violence is hideous, rather than frequent. Less than 1 in 6 rape are reported, making it, quote, extraordinary, end quote, and sets the stage for sensationalist prosecution. Friedman and D'Emilio write, quote, the fears and outrage that the great charge elicited among whites was such that initially few responded to the moral challenge that lynching posited. Instead of accusations of rape encourage the demise of white support for racial equality. At best, white leaders shifted the onus onto black people and urged them to stem the tide of sexual assault. But more often, commentators accepted the truth of the charge and sought an explanation from propensity of black men to commit sexual offense. Increasingly, sexual pathology is understood to include all types of assailants. Physical appearance, however, continues to demarcate savage or civilized sexuality, whereby implicating or absolving defendants in crime. According to Sander Gilman, quote, the other's physical features, from skin color to sexual structures, such as the shape of the genitalia, are always the antithesis of the idealized selves. Sexual autonomy is so important a part of self-image that sexually different is tantamount to pathological. End quote. Frantz Fanon, dramatic assertion, quote, whoever says grape says, they use the N-word, black person, N-E with the R-O, refers to the imago in the white mind of a black male with a white female. Mythologized whiteness is a form of absolution in most state representation of sexual violence. Some subaltern communities, I wonder if I'm saying that right, subaltern. Let me make sure I'm saying this right. I was saying it right. Yay, look at me. Communities reverse this process. Whiteness becomes a marker of guilt, signifying the abuses of racial supremacy, whereas blackness represents resistance and exists as a marker of virtue. The Black Power movement often cites misogynist passages of black men posing and posturing with Fanon's amigo as weapon and security blanket in the cultural imaging of white mainstream black people symbolize sexual criminality. In this way, Fanon generalization seems accurate, particularly if one restates it. Quote, whoever says in black, which is the N word they use, with the O, says grape, end quote. That is, rather than reduce sexual violence to a type of being, one reduce the being to a type of violent act. For Fanon, whites in general are, quote, convinced that the black person, using the N word for black person, is a sexual beast, end quote. Describing Martinican attitudes towards the Senegalese. Fanon's also suggests that black people, which he uses the N word again with the EO, are similarly convinced. These images are replayed as a cultural constant, both in effective and factual accounts of reality. Quote, European culture has a imago of the black person. On the screen, the black person faithfully produces the I don't know how to say that, imago. I'm gonna look that word up real quick. I love looking up words. It's Amigo. And it says, oops, wrong one. Oh, wrong one again. Amigo. Final and fully developed adult stage of an insect. Okay. An unconscious, idealized mental image of someone, especially a parent, which influences a person's behavior. All right. Fanon's reference to the movie screen can be extended to television and local and national crime news, in which the criminal incident chosen for illustration seemingly prove the stereotype. Today, more than a few black people and non-black people suffer from a phobia of black people. Ordinary violence is black on black, white on black, or white on white. Extraordinary violence is black on white in the mainstream representation, or white on black is subaltern representation. Within these constructs, the rare is the most reprehensible, the symbol is the norm, and all are invented to express rage and fear as possible acts. Even though state protections, if and when it comes, is desperately welcomed, it is not necessarily a manifestation of the state's interest of people's safety. Protection appears and disappears with the whims and interests of the state as violent programs. Many state as it regulates and deregulates violence, funds and defunds violence and anti-violent programs. Sorry, I forgot all that. Many seem to have given up on any hope of adequate state protection from the prevention of violence, particularly those who live in communities represented represented as either violent or deviant. The safety of captive communities rarely seem to coincide with state concern. Safety becomes like protection, a commodity that is sold to those who can afford to purchase it, or a possibility for those who demand it. Oh my God! So they're saying like your violence, the violence that's put on you, has been commodified, and if you are in a certain status, you can buy your way into be able to. My God. Okay. Conclusion, and then we'll finish. Well, we have 20 minutes. Conclusion. Today, women and people of color are invited to participate in determining legal action within the context outlined by the state. Feminist and anti-racist perspectives on violence have influenced the media and laws of prosecution. The days of whites only and men only juries are past. Increasingly, women and subaltern ethnic peoples take part in trials as judges, district attorneys, and prosecutors, wielding the state police and prosecutorial powers. I can't say that word. They assume the impartial objectivity of institutionally authorized voices, where legitimacy relies on conservative ideology. However, the mainstream acquaintance of feminists and black people depends on their mirroring and masking the dominant biases. Speaking authoritatively may require asserting state functions as fact. The appropriation of black and or women's voices and bodies allow state prosecution to decolorize and feminized. When the state is feminized or racialized as victim, it garners a sympathy that deflects from the misinterpretations of sexual violence and is own implementation of violence. More often than not, it is safer and more socially acceptable to participate in rather than oppose state prosecutorial whimsy concerning sexual and racial violence. Sometimes indictments are just, other times they invoke morality plays in which symbolic rage incites and executes its own violence, rationalizing punishment as a form of protection, supplanting the original violent act. Persecution carried out by a mob, the police, or the court may create new forms of violence. With this kind of abuse differs from social violence in its hegemonic moralism and contested legitimacy. The historic symbolic persecution of sexual violence used as a weapon of terror against black people has left a peculiar legacy for contemporary society in which the black remains linked to the image of let me go make sure I know this right. It says I don't know. Let me make sure. I'll right back. Contributions. No idea. Here we go. This is what it means. Oh my gosh, come back. Right here. Strong sexual desire, lust. That's what that means. All right. And violence. The fact that black people are accused of being sexually violent and promiscuous has suggested that they have a greater, quote, invulnerability to injure, that in turns what has rationalized anti-black violence, portrayed as neutralized by violence and impervious to pain. Black people allegedly invite abuse. valorizing the state as a neutral prosecutor of a protector from violence requires ignoring its instrumental role to fomenting racial and sexual violence. Like the family, the state, quote, protects, end quote, itself from exposure and confrontations by discrediting or muting stories and erasing them in historical text and news sources that denounces the caprice in punishing sexual violence as a spectacle. Stories that condemn sexual and racial violence are probably perceived as most disturbing, for they contest claims to morally legitimacy by the state, the possibility of criticizing prosecutorial performance that is shaped by racism and sexism, while at the same time supporting survivors as an anomaly in the sporting arena of the courtroom. Their polarizing schoolyards challenges mandates and choosing of sides. Either one is pro-prosecution, pro-survivor, a hard on crime, or pro-defense, anti-survivor, or soft on crime. To question the function of punishment, rage, and symbolism as prerequisites for justice is cast as morally dubious. The state defines the terms for the prevention of prosecution and of and the protection of sexual violence is prosecutorial performances deflect social concerns from the overwhelming majority of sexual violent cases. Most sexual assaults go unreported. Only a fraction of reported cases go to trial, and those litigated, few end in convictions. Most often, the assailants are known by the victims/survivors and share their ethnicity, economic status, classroom, neighborhoods, or even home, as a masking technique for states that refuse to grapple with the specificity of sexual violence. Sensationalized show trials shed the state from critiques of racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism in court. The mythologies unchallenged during such trial obscure racial and sexual violence. Rather than advocate vigilante or privatized police forces as diverse as white gangs or the Nation of Islam patrols of urban neighborhoods, one could explore other forms of civic responses to social and criminal violence. For instance, those guided by human rights covenants. Many, particularly disenfranchised people, stand on shifting ground and relationships to state prosecutorial powers. Sometimes police brutality and court malevolence would seem to caution against copper forming and in spectacles of rage. Yet media demonization and social wildness around crime support acquiescence of state violence as protections and prosecution. Fearing vulnerability to violence, some may yield a myth or moralizing in a state which is unwilling to fund prevention, treatment, and support services adequately in order to gain promises of safety and performances of selective ritualized punishment. Front row seats or stage roles in televised punishment offer a spectacle of show trials which we may watch with conviction that we are closer to the hunters than the hunted. This one says, how much more do we have left? Holy crap. Okay. All right, we'll end it. We're going to finish it up. A little bit more to go, but we're going to finish it up. All right. Sidebar, private traumas and public spectacles. Late for a woman's soccer meeting in Manhattan, I accepted a ride after a night class with a fellow graduate student who assured me that he was heading my way. He was African, unlike the nameless white man who stopped at the San Antonio bus stop to offer me, a 17-year-old late for work at the mess hall, a lift. When I said to both that I would take public transportation, both insisted there was no inconvenience. Each was going in my direction. Like the good old boy and black grad student drove several miles before hooking his arm around my neck and choking me. Wow, that ought to be scary. More literate than the Texan, who only used physical force. My classmate attacked my resistance with psychoanalysis. Quote, you probably prefer white men, end quote. Jesus Christ. Quote, you're oh my gosh, I gotta look up this word. Sorry, everybody. Enamored of our Father, end quote. Unlike the quote unquote cracker who pulled the car off the highway into a wooded area, the quote brother parked along North Central Park to grape me. While I was struggling with him, a patrol car pulled up alongside the car. Two white cops eyed us from behind. They rolled up the window. Startled, we stopped, fighting along enough to stare back. In those few seconds, I never thought to ask the police for help. They never offered protection. As they pulled away, I opened the door and began running at 10 a.m. alongside the park towards the subway. Unlike my escape out of the woods into the Texas highway, no black woman with two children in her car insisted on helping me as my assailant cruised beside me, unapologetically assuring me that now he would drive me to work. I missed work that day at the Air Force Base, just as I later missed my meeting at night. When I tried to report a white stranger's attempted rape, the police who came to my house reasoned that because it would be his word against mine, it was not worth filling out an incident report. 7 years later, I never bothered to report a black colleague's attempted rape. Instead, I just reminded myself to find other ways to travel. Like Taki and Norma, many might locate alternative routes, finding and believing themselves to be beyond state protection. Self-reliance, straying through fear and isolation, merely feeds rage and despair. Organizing a different route for travel also involves community. Building community resistance to violence is a way to move away from symbolic rage of state prosecutorial performance and titillation of racial and sexual spectacles, the criminalization of social neglect and racialized groups. In family tales, the state spectacle, alike private and public violence, intersect. Studying family stories and social analyses, one might construct narratives of racial and sexual violence that map roads other than those demarcated by the state. In fact, one could conceivably stretch the context of personal and political relations to community and state that forgoes indifferences to pain, grief, and justice. Rarely told, frequently exploited, and rejected, stories about racial and sexual abuse are often unable to achieve even the best intentions. Left dangling narratives about personal violence fade as grief and anger recede to half memories. Typically, many label their non-fictive stories as painful and embarrassing. Rape, incest, domestic abuse for poor and or black families. The stories depict victimization by police, courts, and the occasional lynching mob. Unless implicated in the story, outsiders, spectators, and foreigners prove more attentive and sympathetic listeners, and yet have little invested in the telling. Many feel no obligation to respond beyond listening. Families and states often discourage storytelling that reveals their vulnerable proximity to, as well as culpability in violence. For example, speaking out about incest or sexual abuse threatens to expose the less than ideal family or state. Ironically, telling the truth about family violence is viewed as destabilizing the family, just as vocalizing state violence and human right abuses is portrayed to destabilize the state. Family and state may shield themselves from confrontations by curtailing the voices of protesters or seeking an end to abuse. Victims and survivors are encouraged to protect others with their silence. Although this leaves them vulnerable to old abuse and denies them their own right to rage, it likely guards them from newer abuses such as social condemnation, isolation, and punishment, for exposes in the classroom, courtroom, church, mosque, temple, synagogues, at the dinner table, as well as in the media, military, or government. Sometimes a family or state deflects attention from its flaws by projecting a victim as its nemesis. Then punishment becomes performance, electrified by symbols that promote the continuity of the romanticized entity. Such punishment, like the silencing of private stories of abuse, distance the victim from vulnerability and grief. The, quote, something better left unsaid, end quote, are generally those that cannot be glorified or celebrated by the idealized self, family, race, and or nation. Likewise, the most marketed or exploited stories for violence are those that do not threaten fragile, idealized identities. At the intersections of racial and sexual violence recounted in family tales, social texts, state scripts, tragedies are dragged across borders, over into silent denials or public spectacles. Rather, abuse is silenced or sensationalized. Each response erases grief and denies protection. Building sites for mourning and safety, one may resist the muting and marketing of pain to demystify racial and sexual mythologies, as well as social contempt for the indifference to the violence in black and female lives. One must analyze state scripts in which symbolic rage masks stereotypes and contempt while suggesting that punishment serves as protection. Personal tales and public text interweave family stories and social spectacles. These narratives clear a space for reflecting on the ways in which private tragedy inspire and mirrors public horror. In their clearing, they may create a moral for audiences, generate some compassionate thought of action. Compassion brings a possibility of identification, and with its struggle, with its subject suffering, a connection that suggests more permanent ties than petty, where one might feel superior and so alienated from the sufferer. These tales are told in call and response fashion, with expectations, even demands for action. Often these expectations are frustrated, even for those who escape apathy. Agency is problematic. Some survivors, particularly survivors of institutional violence, doubt their own strength and collective power. Consequently, extortions that have assumed more responsibility in the world that is irresponsible enough to abuse them seems burdensome and accusatory. Nevertheless, many survivors speak about the organized to counter violence. Occasionally, their stories about sexual and racial abuse are received as instructive. On other occasions, these narratives are used to depressurize and legitimize everyday rage against violence and any group associated with inflicting it. Sometimes those who reveal their stories see them turn into spectacles. The price for acceptance of the story no longer rejected is the marketplace. Functioning with the worst intentions, commodified tales entertain and in their performance encourage detachment and passivity. The unengaged as immorally amused or morally amused spectator. This discourse in community gathering, news commentary, or surrogate events. The spectacle replaces political actors with social spectators, those raised to, quote, never put their business in the streets, end quote, avoid becoming spectacles and fleeing associative contamination from the indiscreet or unlucky. If ever implicated in the tale or confronted by the urgent request for assistance, thus concerned and unable to assume the role of detached viewer, one can suppress the story, deny its validity, erase its danger, seeking a safe haven as audience, shielded as an anonymous spectator. One can wield a illusory control over the tragedy as spectacle, turning pain into performance. This search for anonymity as a measure of safety in turn patterns our speech and acts. Many, even survivors, rarely discuss as engages the event that highlight their vulnerability to violence. Those who do might find that sharing stories provides an essential narrative, an ethical text that deprives. I gotta look up this word. It's two words. So it won't let me say the word, so I have to show you the definition. Because I can't say the word. A transfer of something from the private sector to the public sector, or making something public that was previously private. That's what that word means. What the hell? Okay, so that word. Pain to border cross into public activism. And that's it. That's all I had to do. Next would be Coalition Crossfire, Anti-Violence Organizing, and Interracial Grape. Jesus. We are ending on page 167. 167. There we go. Make sure I got my bookmark in. Yeah, I got my bookmark in. Okay. All right. Well, that was heavy and a lot. And it was to the point where they talked about how women are not taking seriously when it comes to rape or assaults. And also talk about the spectacle of lynching people and stuff like that, and how they made it a spectacle and entertainment purposes, and how they make it, and how it transferred into different types of spectacles, like the O.J. Simpson trial and all those things, those spectacles of collective punishment and stuff like that, and the non adherence to listening to women, especially black women's essays and stuff like that, and not taking them seriously, and just, you know, and how the state also responds to those things, and like how it calls out the state of its contradictions, and it's like, no, we need to shove it aside because the state's fine, the family structure is fine, these, you know what I mean? And when all these things, all these acts that are happening surrounding these violent acts is just like seen as normality or not taken seriously, you know what I mean? Or seen as spectacles for entertainment, for sensationalizing things, as she said. So very heavy on that one. That was a heavy one, you know? So let's see what happens next time. Chapter 8 is going to be, I already said that, Coalition, Crossfire, Anti-Violence, Organizing, and Interracial Grape, and stuff like that. So that's got to be a horrible story to remember. That's your family story. I would hate that. But anyways, I don't think anybody's going to come up. So I do appreciate everybody. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the shares. And whoever sticked around, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. I know that I have problems with words and sometimes reading itself, but it's okay. This is a good experience for me, and this is heavy. So, all right, everybody. Well, I hope you all the best.